Legends ZA, the next Pokemon game, is about a year away from release, and while we still have no new information, that's not stopping the community from speculating on the endless possibilities this game can bring to the series. And while in my last video we talked about how the game could function mechanically, I purposefully left out the discussion on the individual Pokemon themselves. They are, as the name implies, the primary focus of the series, and definitely deserve their own video. That way we can talk about what Pokemon will be returning for Legends ZA, as well as any new regional variants and evolutions that could appear. And potentially most exciting of all, what new Mega Evolutions will be revealed in Legends ZA. But before we do that, we have to take a couple steps back and get a rough estimate of how many Pokemon will be available in the first place. That way we can properly gauge everything. Legends Arceus released with a total of 242 Pokemon, but considering Arceus was a risk for Game Freak and also the first project on their new engine, I imagine it had a huge effect on why the game had nearly half the amount compared to the other two recent mainline entries, each with around 400 Pokemon in their base game. Nevertheless, ZA doesn't have these barriers, meaning it has the room to have more Pokemon available, especially if it's sharing resources developed in Scarlet and Violet, similar to how remakes were often built off the resources from their previous entries. This could allow the pool of Pokemon to reach as high as 400, but since it is the B team and we don't know the extent of ZA's production, let alone the gameplay, I think a safer choice would be 350. After all, we still have to factor in Megas, which would surely take up resources. Looking at the actual Pokedex though, Gen 4 Pokemon make up 44% of Legends Arceus with 107 Pokemon total. By comparison, Gen 6 has significantly less Pokemon with 72, which would make up 21% of ZA's dex, assuming that it is 350. Bearing in mind that Mega Evolution will play a significant role in this game, I think it's fair to assume they'll have all, if not most of the species of Pokemon capable of Mega Evolving brought back. The only ones that would feel out of place are the Kanto and Hoenn starters since they're not native to the land of Kalos, but they could pull a Sycamore and still give one to you at a certain point in the game. Also, Mewtwo. If this game exists in the past, how the hell will it exist? I guess the future believers get that at the very least. Assuming all of them make it into the game, that would be a total of 97 species. Technically 98 if we include Cleavor. Scarlet and Violet had Black Augurite, so they could maybe make it work. But it could even be a clean 100 if Primal Groudon and Kyogre make an appearance. Although the 3 super ancient Pokemon already being in the Indigo Disc has me thinking otherwise. Now this is already a lot of Pokemon with 170. Already 70% of Arceus' dex and would be nearly half of ZA's dex. But to fill up the remaining half, we should look towards the actual Kalos dex. In BDSP, the Sinnoh dex had 151 Pokemon, with only 16 of them not being in Legends Arceus. And even in Platinum, out of all the 210 Pokemon available, that number barely increases to 20. 21. I forgot Tropius. So I think it could be a decent metric to use for ZA. Now granted, the 457 Pokemon in the Kalos dex is significantly more than the 210 of Platinum. So we have to look at this a little differently, which is why I'd like to remind you guys of a little thing called Dexit. By the end of Sword and Shield's life cycle, there was a total of 234 Pokemon that were unable to be transferred into it. And out of this pool of Pokemon, 73 species were available in Legends Arceus, with a whopping 44 out of all 107 Gen 4 Pokemon being among that group. By comparison, there are 292 Pokemon currently unavailable in Scarlet and Violet, with 162 of them being available in the original XY games, 25 being from Gen 6. If we add those to the list, obviously excluding repeating species like Megas and Gen 6 Mons, that's an additional 113 Pokemon available to add to the game, making for a grand total of 283. Now again, I should remind you that not every Pokemon available in BDSP or Platinum were in Legends Arceus, so 113 could still easily be me highballing. In fact, out of these 113, 35% of them are Pokemon that were already available in Arceus, which makes sense considering from a gameplay perspective, you don't want your newest Pokemon game set in a completely different region to have a huge overlap with a previous game in terms of usable Pokemon. You'd want to offer a new, refreshing pool of Pokemon, which means sometimes Pokemon will take breaks from being available in the base game. This is also often why in remakes, the amount of Pokemon available is increased to incorporate Pokemon from newer generations. It helps to spice it up a little bit. For Legends Arceus, we see 22 Pokemon from after Gen 4 appear, each one of them offering something new in the process. But the concept of refreshing the available Pokemon can also apply to older ones as well, as we see Pokemon that haven't had any relevance in a while given some love, often in the form of a new evolution or regional variant. For Hisui, all 35 new Pokemon and variants shared the fact that they were all extensively tied to the culture of Hisui in Japan, actively representing different aspects of the land and environment, which I feel will absolutely be carried over into ZA. If any Pokemon received a new form or evolution, it would be explicitly tied to French culture, and this can come in many facets. For example, any animals native to France that have an overlap with a Pokemon from another region can draw upon that inspiration and receive a new form based on changes in the environment. And this isn't exclusive to native animals either. Imagine mythological folklore from France influencing new designs, discoveries and technological advances from the Industrial Revolution being reflected through the native Pokemon, and full-on locations and natural wonders that have since diminished, having Pokemon that could have only lived in those areas. There's genuinely so many possibilities for regional variants that it's nearly impossible to predict what Pokemon could be used, as nearly anything can be twisted to have ties or connections to the culture of France, which is why it's very convenient that we already have starters with French characteristics built into their design. Upon the announcement of ZA, most people assumed we'd experience something similar to Arceus, with starters from other regions making their appearance as our premier choices for the game. It helped to diversify the available Pokemon in Arceus, while also establishing a connection to the land of Hisui through regional variants. And it was done in an incredibly smart way too, with each starter from Legends Arceus being based on animals native to either the region of Hokkaido or surrounding areas of Japan, as well as their respective regions also being tied historically to the land during the Meiji Restoration. Serperior and Empoleon fit this bill nearly perfectly, with Serperior's design having strong French royalty Rose of Versailles themes, as well as the USA and France being historical partners, with events such as the Statue of Liberty being gifted to the USA occurring around the same time of Legend ZA, presumably. And with the prevalence of different snake species in France, it feels like Serperior could be a perfect fit for this region, with a regional variant maybe being based on the more draconic folklore involving serpents. Similarly, Empoleon holds a very obvious Napoleon Emperor motif to its design, and with France being a diplomatic partner of Japan, especially during the second half of the 1800s, I feel it also has a pretty decent chance of being a starter. The only disconnect with Empoleon being that penguins obviously aren't native to France. Or are they? No, they're not. But similar to how newer regions have Pokemon based on connected territories, it's very funny that France administrates a territory known as, Ile des Penguins. I don't know how to say that.
Ile des Pingouins.
Thank you. Essentially France's Penguin Island, where unlike the Emperor Penguin, the main inspiration behind Empoleon's design, this island is dominated by a huge population of Macaroni Penguin. Combine that with the story of a French satire sharing the same name, and that could easily help set up for a regional variant. Now for the Firestarter, we unfortunately have no leads, since unlike these two, there's no obvious French connection with any of the Firestarters. You could maybe argue Cinderace has one, since FIFA was founded in France, but Game Freak could just as easily use one of the other starters and establish a French connection to them as well. That's what happened with Decidueye, and it's not like any of the other fire candidates have reasons stopping them from being available. All of them are animals native to France, and most of them have some form of folktale or history that can be associated with the country as well. So it truly does feel like a toss-up on which will be used. Even if we get rid of Emboar and Infernape to prevent duplicate regions, accounting for Serperior and Empoleon, it still leaves it as a choice between Incineroar and Cinderace. And that's still assuming that the Gen 1 and Gen 3 starters are excluded because of their megas. There's just a lot of ifs in this scenario, making it too impractical to pinpoint which fire starter could be used, leaving a big question mark on our final regional variant fire starter. Please be Cinderace. Don't give this demon something else to terrorize VGC with. Very similarly, it's also pretty hard to predict what Pokemon could get new evolutions, considering they can operate under similar logic as regional variants, and tie anything broad enough into French culture. But unlike regional variants, Game Freak usually gives new evolutions to Pokemon that are underpowered or haven't held any significance in a while, often both. 4 out of the 6 new evolutions in Arceus were given to Pokemon that are pretty weak. Scarlet and Violet similarly gave new evolutions to weaker Pokemon. And Bisharp. Yeah. And Sword and Shield only gave new evolutions to underpowered or underrepresented Pokemon. So I definitely expect this trend to continue, because trust me, a lot of Pokemon need it, especially Gen 2. If I had a nickel for every time a Gen 2 Pokemon got a new evolution or variant, I'd have 38 nickels? God damn! That's a Costco hot dog and spare change. Which brings me to these guys. I really wouldn't be surprised if one of these guys got an evolution in ZA, especially considering all of them are present in XY. I'm personally leaning towards Macargo of all things because of the cultural connection snails have in France, as well as easy setup with Kalos's geothermal power plants, and the potential mythological beasts to draw from. But this could also just as easily be applied through a regional variant. Regardless, I think it's reasonable to expect around 5 new evolutions, hopefully from weaker Pokemon that need that extra oomph to be relevant again. Also, adding on to what we said with regional variants, I imagine if any Pokemon from newer regions were to be present in Kalos, it would follow Legends Arceus' footsteps, by having them be present because of their cultural relevance and gaining something new to reflect it. Well, with the exception of one group of Pokemon. Unlike Arceus that takes place in Sinnoh, separate from future regions, ZA's Kalos is right next to 2 younger regions, even bordering Paldea. And considering how ZA was most likely planned during Scarlet and Violet's production, I wouldn't be surprised if they arranged for them to have some relations and overlap. Scarlet and Violet already does this by having trainers you battle closest to the border all retain Dragon-type Kalos Pokemon, as well as passing references to Mega Evolution. So if any region from a future generation were to have the most representation in ZA, Paldea would be it. And unlike Arceus, where every Pokemon from future regions were tied to a cultural aspect, the Paldeamons don't have to follow this pattern, and could easily be Pokemon that simply exist in Kalos, being more prominent in the southern areas of the map, since it's closer to the border. Consequently, because of the proximity, regional variants wouldn't really make sense, so if Paldeamons were to get anything, it would really only make sense in the form of a new evolution or a new Mega. And when we take into account how some Pokemon from Paldea are vastly underpowered compared to their contemporaries, it makes you wonder if this was the plan all along. Like, why did they make Spidops so bad, man? Bro feels like a middle evolution. We haven't seen a bug type done this dirty since, well, Gen 6. In addition, there are other Paldeamons as well that feel a bit awkward in terms of design, giving off heavy, middle of the road energy, although I can see those Pokemon going in the other direction. Alright, time to address the elephant in the room. Mega Evolution is by far the most anticipated aspect of Legends ZA and has been the hottest topic of discussion for the game. But in order to talk about it, we need to bring up the context behind its implementation in Gen 6. XY introduced the smallest group of new Pokemon for a region, with just 72, and this had a lot to do with both the jump to 3D taking up a lot of resources for Creatures Inc., as well as the creation of 50 new Mega designs, making it so Gen 6 technically introduced 122 new Pokemon forms, which actually puts it right in 4th place for total new forms per species compared to other generations. 5th if we include regional variants. But that's also where things get complicated, as regional variants didn't exist during XY, and thus couldn't take up resources for new Mega evolutions. The biggest limiting factor for the amount of Pokemon introduced per generation is the inevitable battle for resources and time, since it takes a lot of effort to create new Pokemon. But now if Legends ZA were to add new regional variants as well as regular evolutions and even potentially the newly added convergent evolutions, it puts into question just how many new Megas will they actually make. And this isn't even mentioning Gen 9 already having 120 new Pokemon, as well as regional variants and terrestrial forms. So it's unreasonable in my opinion to expect a bunch of newly added Mega evolutions. Rather than the 30 Megas introduced in XY, I think a more realistic outlook would be 15 to 20 for Legends ZA, which to be fair at least falls in line with Oraz, which only added 18 Megas plus the 2 primal reversions. But now that we have an idea on how many new Mega evolutions Legends ZA could add, we can talk about which Pokemon are likely to receive them. I think the most obvious and immediate choice is Yveltal and Xerneas, especially after Legends Arceus gave its box legendaries origin forms. Granted, it might not specifically be Mega Evolution itself, considering Groudon and Kyogre experience something functionally the same, but for all intensive purposes, I imagine whatever new forms they get will be treated in a similar lens to Mega Evolution, regardless of if it is or not. The next Pokemon I could see easily getting Mega Evolutions are the Kalos starters themselves. It would help to differentiate them from our starters with their regional variants. And if the Gen 1 and 3 starters do return, it would help them to not get overshadowed by their Mega Evolution. This would also just give them a more important role, something that I felt Legends Arceus kind of lacked with its Gen 4 starters, as all that game really did was make them rare to find. It could also explain why Ash Greninja is no longer in the game, despite Battle Bond still being in Scarlet and Violet. I always found it really weird that Scarlet and Violet, despite clearly putting a lot of effort into the actual Pokemon themselves, having the second most amount of Pokemon behind Sun and Moon, didn't include Ash Greninja. And it's not like they just didn't have time to add it, since Greninja wasn't in the base decks of Scarlet and Violet. It was added later, despite the nerfed Battle Bond being present in the game since day one. It almost felt intentional, like they wanted to remove it, especially with the art in Clavel's house clearly referencing Ash Greninja in some sort of way, with the shuriken and the matching color schemes. So is it possible that it was intentionally excluded from the game? And if so, could it have been to repurpose the design through Mega Evolution? And that art is merely just a hint at this. That way the removal of Ash Greninja will be less of a retcon and more of an explanation, almost like a pseudo Mega Evolution, which, taking into consideration how Ash Greninja functions in the anime, it matches up very well. This would also allow Chestnut and Delphox, who were unfortunately left in the dust by Greninja, to get some more spotlight again. And trust me, Chestnut definitely needs it. Come to think of it, it's kind of crazy that despite Gen 6 introducing Mega Evolution, only one Pokemon from Gen 6 actually received it, and it was a mythical at that. And with future generations giving special treatment to their Pokemon through their respective gimmicks, if any generation of Pokemon deserves a Mega Evolution, it would be Gen 6. So let's go down the list. Immediately we can get rid of Pokemon with multiple models that would make it too hard for a coherent Mega design. Similarly, Gourgeist fits into this bill with its different sizes and altering stats, potentially being a problem for Mega Evolution. We can also disqualify Pokemon a part of multi-generational groups or have had recent preferential treatment. We can also factor in aspects of older Mega designs that can make it problematic, such as how in prior games any gender differences present on a Pokemon were completely removed for the Mega design. So unless they change the way the system works, then Pokemon like Pyroar or Meowstic can be crossed out. Then there are Pokemon that come in pairs, so if one receives a Mega, then the other would most likely get one as well, which personally to me makes them less likely, but still decently possible. There's also the problem of Pokemon with more complicated designs that change, such as Florges or Aegislash, who while doable, could run into complications of how it would be applied for a Mega Evolution. Still, I think they also have a decent chance, especially when we consider the basis for a lot of Mega Evolutions stemmed from popularity, which is why they gave already strong Pokemon an even stronger form, and 2 Charizards. Let's just hope we don't get a third. I mean, we basically already do. But another purpose for Mega Evolution was to once again give weaker Pokemon an opportunity to be powerful, which is why I think Noivern is the perfect fit, as it fulfills both the popularity and the underpowered conditions.
I'm gonna get you out of here, I promise you!
And with Goodra unlikely to receive one due to its regional variant 2 years ago, Noivern could be treated like the powerful alternative dragon, rather than another pseudo getting one. Even though Goodra kinda needs it. Sorry, buddy. And on that note, Talonflame I feel could be a good candidate for its popularity and subsequent drop in usage since its nerfs, as well as being a parallel to Mega Pidgeot, which would also be an optional choice early on in the game. Hawlucha is also relatively popular, and while not weak, it also isn't relatively broken either, and I can see them doubling down on the Luchador theme if they were to give it a Mega, especially considering the fact that Luchadors date as far back as the 1860s, originating in Mexico during the French occupation. I also doubt Hoopa, despite its popularity, will get one considering it already has Unbound, and Volcanion is probably just as unlikely since it severely lacks popularity and still has the power plant to offer it some sort of relevance. And for the rest of them, even if they lack popularity, I feel they at the very least have a likely chance of receiving one. Carbon could have a Mega building off Diance's royal aesthetic, and Heliolisk could have a more Sun and Fire oriented Mega. And Barbaracle? Overall, there's just a lot of possibilities, and even if only half of them received Megas, that's still a solid 6 or 7 Megas that we can add to the list. So in total we'd have about 11 to 12 Megas out of the 20 potential slots, just coming from Gen 6 Pokemon, which I feel is decently reasonable. Now even though the final slots could be literally any Pokemon, I still think there are some pretty likely choices that we can anticipate. Flygon and Jynx being the most immediate answer since they were originally planned to Mega Evolve, but ran into complications preventing them from making it into the game. But now that we're revisiting the mechanic, we can finally give them the Megas they deserved 10 years ago. I also think it's worth noting that Megas this time will probably take a different design philosophy than when they were first introduced in Gen 6. With every new region, there has been a greater and greater focus on connecting the Pokemon to the respective culture and environment their land is based on, which is a departure from how XY's Megas were designed, as they kinda just built upon the already established foundation of the Pokemon. Since then, we've seen how every Alolan Pokemon has ties to Polynesia and Hawaii, as well as every Galar Pokemon being incredibly British, and how all the Hisui Pokemon scream feudal Japan. And even in the most recent DLCs, we see new evolutions and convergent evolutions based on the culture of their surrounding regions. I fully expect new Megas to carry over this design philosophy, and have several French elements woven into their design, which is why I think a Pokemon like Milotic is a great fit for Mega Evolution, as it reflects the core theme of XY in beauty, as well as building on the mythological concepts of sea serpents and mermaids, which were very prevalent in French folklore. It would also help to contrast Gyarados, as they're often treated like counterparts. I could also maybe see Mega Magnezone, as it could build upon the industrial setting that Legend ZA seems to take place in, while also strangely enough giving context to the Pokedex, stating how it can evolve again, despite it being the final evolution. Game Freak has taken old Pokedex entries and altered them to reflect the ever-evolving world of Pokemon, so this could be another one of those moments. But at this point, I'm basically just guessing. The truth of it is that Game Freak could literally use any Pokemon they wanted, and I could easily have blind spots in favor of my own favorite Pokemon. I mean, personally, I'd love a Mega Sunflora. Yeah, I bet you didn't think Sunflora had shooters, did ya? But on a more serious note, I think it could be really cool, especially with how much focus it got in Paldea as a reflection of the IRL sunflower fields of Castilla-La Mancha, and with France being the second largest sunflower seed producer, with its own absolutely huge sunflower fields, which we technically see reflected in XY already through the heavy garden areas of Central Kalos, as well as one lady referencing Sunflora in the NSR Sundial. I think it could make for a great addition to the game. But that's just Sunflora fan number 3 speaking. Still, as fun as it is to speculate on what new Megas we'll get in Legend ZA, it's basically just that, speculation, and I could be completely wrong about any of this. But with Game Freak's past trends, I feel it's pretty likely that we'll have around 5 new evolutions, up to 10 regional variants or convergent evolutions if they stick with that, and hopefully 15 to 20 new Mega Evolutions. It's a nice even 30 new forms total, and would probably put Gen 9 in line with 1 and 5 with having the largest number of new Pokemon species, with up to 150 total. And then you tack on the yellow mythical star Pokemon for 151, and that in my opinion would be a great way to end Generation 9's Dex. ZA has so much potential for the series, and I'm incredibly excited to see what it can bring in regards to just the Pokemon themselves. And if you guys are excited as well and enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. There's an endless amount of possibilities for new Pokemon, so feel free to share in the comments what you yourself would like to see in Legend ZA. I read literally every comment, and I enjoy hearing your guys' reactions. That being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a damn good one. Please don't give Incineroar Mega. Please, Game Freak, I'm begging you.